From 1869 to 1972, Australia's attempts to create a homogeneous white society led to the creation of a forced assimilation policy. This initiated the systematic destruction of the basic human rights and culture of Australia's Aboriginal population. Those who suffered from this cataclysm are known as the Stolen Generation. Since the 1970s, the Australian government has attempted to compromise through national recognition days in various governmental organizations that target homelessness, PTSD, and unemployment among the natives. However, Australia's attempts to compromise with the Aboriginal people are ineffective, as conflict still reigns within the country and many survivors still suffer physically, psychologically, and financially. Natives continue to fight the injustices, demanding equality, respect, and compensation for the eradication of their culture. Although many factors led to the incitement of conflict between the Europeans and Aboriginals, none were more significant than colonialism. On May 13, 1787, British soldiers reached and settled on the continent of Australia to create penal colonies, establishments used to punish Great Britain's exiled prisoners. Eventually, these colonies grew into settlements. The expansion of British control over the island would spur centuries of conflict between the two cultures. Great Britain's advancements as a civilization in what was then called New South Wales gave the British more reason to believe the white race was superior. Deeming the Aboriginals inferior, they began to eliminate Aboriginal culture through forced assimilation and cultural restrictions. However, the British Select Committee criticized the Australian colonies for their treatment of the Aborigines, and recognized the Aboriginal people's plain and sacred right to land and wanted a Protectors of Aborigines Board. Consequently, the British Parliament created the Victorian Board for the Protection of Aborigines, along with the Aboriginal Protection Act of 1869 to pacify accusations of mistreatment. However, to re-establish their power over the Aborigines and their land, the British Parliament created new policies called the Aborigines Protection Acts of 1909 and 1910. These protection acts granted officials the authority to take individuals from their families without ethical justification. Dubbed the White Australian Policy, it aimed to create a homogeneous white Australia. The act applied primarily to children the Europeans referred to as half-caste, a derogatory term used to identify Aboriginals who seemed to possess white ancestry.
I was one of 9 siblings, and 6 of us were taken. I couldn't understand why. My mum and dad were at work, and my father he was a rat off Tobruk for 5 years. He fought for this country, and I took his kids.
Individuals were taken from their families, taught to reject their indigenous heritage, and were forced to adopt Anglo-Saxon culture. Those with light skin would be adopted by white families. Those with darker skin would be placed in institutions such as Abomanderi Children's Home, Cootamundra Aboriginal Girls' Home, Kinchela Aboriginal Boys' Home, Kempsey, and many others. Here, they faced psychological, physical, and sexual abuse and were falsely told that their parents had died. They were completely cut off from their heritage. These individuals are known as the Stolen Generation. Their removal played a crucial role in the eradication of Aboriginal culture. Soon, Aboriginals were deprived of citizenship, voting rights, and were discriminated against.
On 6th of September 1943, during a brownout of Melbourne down here, Royal Women's Hospital, stolen from Royal Women's Hospital and raised in an institution in Melbourne, Box Hill. And the program in there, besides the sexual abuse and the unusual punishments, was to dissuade me, the lone Aboriginal, registered Aboriginal in that Box Hill Boys' Home, to be, persuaded against any sense of his Aboriginality.
During the 1950s, former victims of the Stolen Generation began to fight for their rights. In 1958, social activists formed the Federal Council for Aboriginal Advancement, or the FCAA, demanding equal citizenship, wages, and employment. While not all demands were met, the government compromised by passing the Commonwealth Electoral Act of 1962, giving all Aborigines federal voting rights. Despite government efforts to compromise, the Aboriginal community had yet to receive full equality. In 1965, Charles Perkins, a social activist of Aboriginal descent, attempted to gain public support by establishing the Freedom Rides, a bus tour of Aboriginal communities. By attracting nationwide news coverage, Perkins brought light to the terrible living conditions of the Aboriginal communities, lack of government funding, and implementation of the white assimilation policy. In 1967, their decade-long struggle for citizenship was finally won. Just over 90% of constituents voted yes to change the Australian Constitution to recognise Aboriginal people as citizens. This decision influenced the 1972 disbandment of the White Australian Assimilation Policy, making the discrimination, removal, and forced assimilation of all Aboriginals illegal. While many are still coming to terms with the trauma they experienced, the Australian government is working to prevent further conflict. On May 26, 1998, the Australian government created National Sorry Day. This annual event brings all of Australia together to remember the mistreatment of the country's Indigenous population, allowing those of Aboriginal descent to mourn over family members who were stolen from them years ago. It wasn't until 2008 when Prime Minister Kevin Rudd issued an apology speech to the Aboriginals.
We reflect on their past mistreatment. We reflect in particular on the mistreatment of those who were stolen generations. This blemished chapter in our national history.
This formal apology inspired nationwide movements. Organizations such as the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, the Victorian Aboriginal Child Care Agency, and the Aboriginal Legal Services Corporation were created to assist with family reunification, PTSD, and unemployment. While the government believes these reformational actions to be a compromise in meeting the demands of those who suffered, the victims of the stolen generation do not perceive it as such. They view the offered compromises as weak and believe more radical action is needed. Some say those who were taken are in a more desirable state now than before. This holds validity, as some were placed in good households and ended up better financially than those who were not. However, this was only a small portion. According to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Healing Foundation, there's still a 50% chance that members of the stolen generation and their family are more likely to be charged by police, 30% are more likely to report to be in bad health, 15% are more likely to consume alcohol at dangerous levels, and 10% are more likely to be jobless. Even though the abductions came to a stop, the forced assimilation policy has left lasting repercussions. Many Aboriginals are angered by government speeches made in response to the apology speech. Some government party members believe victims of discrimination have a legal right to pursue compensation. Others believe Australians should not be held accountable for past wrongdoings. Even Prime Minister Kevin Rudd stated,
"We will not, under any circumstances, be establishing any compensation arrangements or any compensation fund." Absolutely blunt on that.
A statement that was congratulated for being a shrewd maneuver that cleared away a piece of political wreckage in a way that responds to some of its own supporters' emotional needs, yet changes nothing. Other party members agreed.
I believe it's an issue of principle that one generation can assume responsibility for the acts and deeds of an earlier generation.
These controversial statements fuel tension between the Aboriginal community and the government. Some claim that race was never a component. They argue that the Aborigines were taken from unsuitable households or guardians for their own safety. They draw comparison to white children, who were sometimes removed by child care services. Other historians argue that racism was undeniably a motivator. White single mothers could apply for a pension to look after their own children. Children could be committed to a suitable relative, and they could be returned to their parents after a period of good behavior. Institutionalized children could be returned home for the holidays. No such provisions existed under the Aborigines Protection Act of 1909, for its intention was to separate children from their parents and their race permanently. To prove the involvement of race in this conflict, an inquiry into the policy of forced child removal was launched in 1995. Between 10% and 33% of all Indigenous children were separated from their families between 1910 and 1970. The report concluded that unnecessary child removal violated basic human rights. Despite the slow restoration of these basic human rights, the Aboriginal culture was almost completely annihilated within Australian society. There were over 500 different clan groups or nations around the continent, many with distinctive cultures, beliefs, and languages. Today, Indigenous people make up 2.4% of the total Australian population. The removal of Indigenous peoples is not solely restricted to Australia. Nations all over the world have similar history of discrimination. There are more and more arrests, killings, and abuses. This is happening in Russia, Canada, the Philippines, all over Latin America, Papua New Guinea, and Africa. It is global. We are seeing a human rights emergency. Conflicts with Indigenous populations is a neglected worldwide problem. By acknowledging past wrongdoings, this worldwide conflict can be terminated. Through this conflict, more radical actions were needed to make amends. The government has yet to restore what was taken from the Aboriginal families, as some are still fighting for the reinstatement of their culture. Ultimately, conflict still remains. This pivotal occurrence in Australia's history highlights the significance of embracing differences in cultures and the disastrous repercussions that can occur to the victims of discrimination.